The evening air bit cold across the reservation flats, carrying dust that scoured exposed skin and left a gritty taste on the tongue. Chaska crouched beside a struggling fire, feeding it twigs scavenged from a stand of cottonwoods 2 miles distant. His left hand trembled as he worked a persistent quiver that had plagued him since February, when he'd spent 3 days mending fence in a blizzard, with no shelter and soaked through wool. The fever had broken his body's rhythm, leaving him with shakes that came and went without warning, sometimes mild as a whisper, other times violent enough to spill coffee from a cup. Between wind-stunted cottonwoods and a ribbon of muddy water, a tin cup rattled against a saddlebag, and the smell of carbolic hung faint in the air. He was 32 broad across the shoulders, his dark hair worn long and bound with rawhide that had once belonged to his father. A puckered scar traced the length of his left forearm, souvenir from a treaty dispute 5 winters back, when boundaries were being carved and tempers ran hotter than good sense. He'd survived that fight, watched 2 friends die in it, but the land kept shrinking anyway. Hemmed in by lines drawn in distant offices by men who'd never walked a mile of prairie or tasted alkali dust in their water. Behind him stood a crude sign, nailed to the gatepost, letters burned into the plank with a hot iron "Want Cook." He'd posted it in Red Mesa 3 weeks ago, tacking it to the mercantile board, while the shopkeeper watched with narrowed eyes, and the men on the street went silent. No one had answered. He hadn't expected different. White folks didn't work for Lakota men, and most Lakota women had their own families to feed their own struggles with the drought that had turned the second year now relentless as the government clerks who kept redrawing the maps. The sound of boots on gravel brought his head up, sharp instinct, honed by years of living where the wrong visitor could mean trouble. A woman stood just inside the gate, one hand gripping the rail for balance, the other cradling an infant wrapped in a faded quilt that had seen better days. She was slight, pale-skinned, and sun-damaged, with dark hair escaping a loose bun that hung crooked on the back of her head. Her dress was gray, homespun, mended at the hem with uneven stitches and dusty from hard travel. Her shoes were split at the seams, bound with twine that cut into the cracked leather. She looked 26, maybe younger in the bones of her face, but her eyes held the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust easy promises or kind words that came with conditions. "I can cook," she said. Her voice was steady despite the exhaustion lining her face, despite the way her shoulders sagged under the weight of the child and whatever burdens she carried beyond him. Chaska studied the carpetbag at her feet with its distinctive cord wrapped around the handle, the bruised knuckles on her free hand, and the way she held the child close, as if shielding him from the world and everything in it. Beyond her, dust rose on the road that ran parallel to the fence. 3 riders moving slow, scanning the land as they came, their postures lazy, but their attention focused. "Railroad men," she said quietly, following his gaze. "Been tracking me since Fort Laramie." The baby stirred a tiny fist emerging from the quilt to grasp at nothing, then finding purchase on the edge of her shawl. Chaska set down his stick and stepped toward her, reaching for the ladle she was extending with her free hand. Their fingers brushed hers cold and work rough, despite the heat of the day, his warm, despite the tremor that made the contact unsteady. He handed it back and gestured toward the nearest lodge, its hide stretched taut over poles and painted with faded symbols his grandmother had drawn before she died. "Inside," he said. She hesitated, glancing back at the riders. They were close now, close enough to make out faces, hard men with gun belts, and the slouching confidence of those who knew the law wouldn't touch them for whatever they chose to do out here, miles from witnesses who mattered. Chaska moved between her and the road, angling his body to block their view of her. His hand came to rest on the rail near where his rifle leaned, not touching the weapon, but available, the message clear to anyone who understood the language of frontier standoffs. The riders slowed their horses, snorting and stamping dust, tossing heads against tight reins. The lead rider was lean and tobacco stained his beard patchy and his hat battered into shapelessness by sun and rain. He spat a brown stream into the dirt and grinned, showing teeth gone yellow and gaps where others had been. Afternoon. He drawled the word stretched long and mocking. Mighty fine setup you got here. Here you posted for a cook. That spot's still open, or you already filled it. Chaska said nothing, his face impassive, his weight balanced in a way that would let him move fast if he needed to. The rider leaned forward in his saddle leather, creaking, and squinted past Chaska toward where the woman stood frozen near the gate. Funny thing we're looking for a woman. Widow got a baby with her. You seen anyone like that come through here? No. The grin widened, showing more of those ruined teeth. That's real interesting, 'cause I could swear I just saw someone fitting that exact description not 2 minutes ago. He tilted his head, studying Chaska like a man might study livestock at auction. You know everything out here's for sale if the price is right. Cook's post included. Hell, the whole camp probably. You think on that. The other two riders laughed rough, ugly sounds that carried no real humor. One of them, younger with a scraggly mustache that barely covered his upper lip, hawked and spat near the gatepost, the glob landing inches from Chaska's boot. Chaska's weight shifted to his back foot, shoulders, squaring hands loose at his sides. His hand stayed off the rifle, but the signal was clear restraint, held by choice, not fear. And the choice could change in a heartbeat. The lead rider held his gaze a long moment, still grinning, and then tugged his reins and turned his horse in a lazy circle. We'll be around, he said, voice carrying easy on the dry air. You need anything at all, you just holler. We're real helpful folks. They rode off, laughter trailing behind them, and didn't look back. But Chaska knew they'd be watching from some ridge or wash-marking the camp's layout, counting heads, assessing weaknesses. He waited until they disappeared over a rise before turning back. The woman had sunk onto a 3-legged stool near the fire, the baby in her lap, her whole body trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. The child's fist had found the edge of a beaded vest hanging on a wooden peg, nearby tiny fingers testing the pattern's texture with the focused intensity that infants brought to their exploration of the world. Thank you, she said quietly, the words barely audible over the crackling of the fire. Chaska nodded. He ladled thin soup, more broth than substance, stretched with wild onions, and the last scraping of cornmeal into a dented tin cup, and handed it to her, watching as she wrapped both hands around it, as if drawing warmth from metal that couldn't give much. Name: Alice Hart. This is Jack. She glanced down at the baby, something fierce and protective crossing her face. The baby turned at the sound of his name, his cheeks chapped red from wind, and sun, his eyes bright with infant curiosity, despite whatever hardships he'd endured in his short life. Chaska. He stirred the pot to keep the bottom from scorching the tremor in his hand, making the motion uneven. Drink first, then tell me why the railroad wants you bad enough to ride out here. Alice cradled the cup, sipping carefully, wincing slightly as the hot liquid hit her cracked lips. She looked down at Jack, then back at Chaska, and he saw her making a calculation, how much to trust, how much to risk. My husband worked for them. Died 6 months ago. They say it was an accident. Her jaw tightened, a muscle jumping near her ear. I don't believe them. And they want what he left behind. She set down the cup with deliberate care and reached into the carpet bag at her feet, pulling out a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and stained with what might have been water or might have been blood, hard to tell, after months of hard travel. He was a surveyor. Mapped routes through reservation land, routes they're not supposed to use. This has all his notes. Distances, markers, everything. If they get it, they'll run track through burial grounds and nobody will stop them. Chaska looked at the journal, then at her face, reading the exhaustion and determination there, the grief that hadn't had time to soften yet. The tremor in his hand steadied as his fingers closed harder around the ladle handle while forcing steadiness where fever had stolen it. "You cook?" "Yes." No hesitation, no false modesty. Just fact. Then you stay. I'll watch the road. Alice's shoulders eased slightly, the first hint of relief since she'd arrived. The wariness still lined her eyes. She adjusted Jack in her arms, settling him more securely against her hip, and nodded once. Outside, the last of the sunlight bled away, leaving a sky the color of old bruises, purple and gray, and that particular shade of red that promised another rainless day tomorrow. Somewhere distant, a coyote howled long and lonely, the sound swallowed by the vastness of the plains and answered by nothing. Chaska added another stick to the fire, his hands still trembling despite the force of will he applied to them, and wondered how long it would be before those riders came back. He gave it 2 days, maybe 3 if they had to ride back to town to report what they'd seen. Not long enough to prepare properly, but enough time to make some plans, shore up some defenses, and maybe, if luck held, which it rarely did, find some allies willing to stand against the railroad and the men it employed. Spring 1882 held the flats near Red Mesa in a grip that showed no mercy and offered no reprieve. The drought had stretched into its second year, turning the grass brittle as old bone and the creeks to mud-choked trickles that barely sustained the fish that had once thrived there. Chaska's cattle herd, never large, perhaps 30 head at its peak, had thinned to 18 animals, whose ribs showed through dull hides as they scraped at sparse forage and competed with prairie dogs for what little green remained. The reservation boundaries, redrawn twice in as many years by clerks in Washington who'd never set foot on the land they were dividing, had squeezed his grazing down to a few hundred acres of alkali soil and rock outcroppings. What had once been communal hunting grounds, shared by families who'd lived here for generations beyond counting, had been parceled out and fenced and claimed by men who arrived with papers bearing official seals and soldiers to enforce those papers when words proved insufficient. He'd been forced to learn farming, a bitter irony, given that his people had been following the buffalo herds, when these same government men were still scratching at rocky New England soil and starving through brutal winters. But the buffalo were gone, hunted to near extinction by men who took the hides and left the meat to rot, and what remained of his world required adaptation or death. He'd tried his hand at a plow that didn't fit right in his grip, designed for men with different builds and different histories. It caught on every root and stone, jarring his shoulders and making the fever tremor in his hands worse. He'd planted corn in rows that looked nothing like the careful plantings his grandmother had shown him as a boy, and watched half of it wither in the drought while prairie dogs and crows took the rest. The fever had started last winter after a brutal week in late January, when a section of fence had gone down in a blizzard. The cattle had started to scatter, and he'd spent 3 days in waist-deep snow, his clothes soaked through to the skin, mending wire with fingers that had gone numb and clumsy. There'd been no dry wood for fire, no shelter except what he could fashion from his own body curled against the wind. By the time he'd finished the job and made it back to camp, the fever had already taken hold. It came and went now, following patterns he couldn't predict. Sometimes it left him steady for days, almost normal, except for the occasional tremor when he was tired or stressed. Other times it returned without warning. Sudden waves of heat and cold that left him shaking so hard he couldn't hold a cup, couldn't steady a rifle, could barely function beyond the most basic tasks of staying alive. Alice Hart was 26. Though the hardness in her eyes and the lines beginning to form at the corners of her mouth aged her beyond her years. She was a widow, her husband dead, 6 months in what the Union Pacific Railroad had officially termed an accidental drowning during a routine survey job in Wyoming Territory. She didn't believe it. She'd known Henry Hart since she was 17, known him as a strong swimmer, who'd grown up on the Delaware River, who taught her to swim in the creek behind her family's farm before they'd married. Known him as a careful man who checked his equipment twice and trusted his instincts when something felt wrong. He'd written her 2 weeks before he died. A vague, worried letter that had taken 3 weeks to reach her through the slow channels of frontier mail. In it, he'd said he'd seen things he shouldn't have seen. That the surveyors were being asked to map routes that violated federal treaty obligations that Caldwell, his supervisor, a man named Silas Caldwell, who wore fine suits and kept meticulous ledgers, was paying off territorial officials to look the other way. Keep the journal safe, he'd written in the letter's final paragraph, and the handwriting rushed and less neat than usual, as if he'd been hurrying or hiding while he wrote. If anything happens to me, it's proof of what they're planning. Take it to the Federal Land Commission. Don't trust the local law. Caldwell owns them. 3 days later, she'd received a telegram informing her that Henry Hart had drowned while surveying a river crossing in the Bighorn Basin. His body had been found downstream, the telegram said, and had been buried in the Territorial Cemetery in Cheyenne due to the distance and the summer heat. His personal effects would be forwarded to her in care of the boarding house where they'd been living. The personal effects had arrived 4 days later: his wedding ring, his pocket watch that had stopped at 3:47, his surveying tools, and the journal, its leather cover water-stained, but the contents miraculously intact. She'd opened it that night in the small room she'd shared with him, with 8-month-old Jack sleeping in his cradle, and had spent hours reading by candlelight, trying to make sense of the technical notations and sketches. What she'd found had chilled her page after page of meticulously documented violations routes that cut through sacred sites marked on old treaty maps, notes about Caldwell's orders to simplify the survey reports and omit sensitive landmarks. And in the margins, in Henry's increasingly cramped handwriting notations that suggested he'd known he was in danger. See, angry about delay. Said inspectors won't care about old bones. Foreman Jensen drunk talking about contract terminations and accidents that aren't accidents. Moving camp tomorrow. We'll try to post this letter first. That had been the last entry, dated 2 days before his death. Alice had packed what little she owned and had left Cheyenne before dawn, before the railroad men could come asking questions about what Henry might have told her, what documents he might have left behind. She'd been running ever since, working odd jobs where she could find them and moving on before anyone could ask too many questions about the widow with the baby and the carpet bag she never let out of her sight. The railroad men had picked up her trail in Fort Laramie, and by the time she'd realized her mistake, there were men watching the boarding house where she'd taken a room. She'd slipped out in the middle of the night, Jack bundled against her chest, and had started walking west with nothing but the clothes on her back and the journal hidden in the false bottom of her carpet bag, a trick her mother had taught her, sewing a pocket into the lining for valuables that needed hiding. Now standing in the small lodge Chaska had offered her with Jack, finally asleep on the pallet and the journal hidden again in her bag, she let herself feel the full weight of her exhaustion for the first time in weeks. She was 26 years old, a widow with an infant son and no family left to turn to. She had nothing except the clothes she wore, the journal she carried, and the fierce determination that Henry's death would mean something. And now she had this: a camp on drought-stricken land, a Lakota warrior with fever-trembling hands who'd stood between her and danger without knowing anything about her, except that she needed help and the fragile possibility that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place to make a stand. The first days established rhythms that felt almost normal, though Alice knew better than to trust the feeling. She rose with the sun nursing Jack, while Chaska was out checking the fence line or tending the cattle. By the time he returned, she'd have coffee boiling weak, stretched with chicory but hot, and whatever she could make from the supplies. He showed her sacks of cornmeal and flour, a barrel of salted beef that had seen better days, a crock of lard that was more than half rancid, but could be trimmed, and used dried beans and onions in a wooden box. The first morning she made johnny cakes from the cornmeal, frying them in lard and serving them with the last of some wild honey Chaska had traded for months ago. He'd eaten in silence, but she'd seen the way his shoulders relaxed slightly, the way he'd taken a second cake without being prompted. "This is good," he'd said finally. "It'll be better when I can get my hands on some eggs and milk," she'd replied. "But this will do for now." He'd nodded, and that had been that, an understanding reached without excess words. Jack was fussy, unsettled by the change in routine and surroundings, and she wore him in a sling, fashioned from a length of cloth, while she worked bouncing him gently against her hip and singing songs her mother had taught her. As she worked, she watched Chaska. He moved carefully, deliberately, as if each motion had to be planned and executed with conscious thought. When the tremor came, she could see it start in his left hand, then spread up his arm to his shoulder. He would stop whatever he was doing and breathe through it. His jaw tight, his eyes focused on some distant point until the shaking eased enough for him to continue. He never complained, never explained. He simply endured the way she imagined he'd endured everything else this land and its history had thrown at him. At one point in that first morning, Jack managed to escape her distracted grasp and crawled with surprising speed toward the fire, his small hand reaching for the bright coals. Chaska, who'd been 20 feet away, working on a saddle, moved faster than she'd have thought possible. He was there in 3 strides, his knee gently nudging Jack back from the fire, his hands scooping the baby up and handing him back to Alice, before Jack could even register what had happened. "Fast," Alice said, her heart still hammering. "Had younger cousins?" Chaska replied. "You learned to move quick around fires." Their eyes met over Jack's head, and something passed between them, a recognition of competence, of the kind of quiet capability that mattered more than words out here. People came and went throughout that first week. Ephraim Pike arrived on the second day, a gaunt white farmer with 3 children and a homestead that bordered Chaska's water access to the north. He brought a bundle of fence posts and traded them for 2 bowls of stew Alice had made from the salted beef, wild onions, and dried beans. He was hollow-cheeked, his cough rattling deep in his chest, and his hands were rough as tree bark. His oldest boy stood behind him, a rail-thin child of maybe 10, with eyes that seemed too large for his face. The boy watched Alice with undisguised fascination as she ladled stew, and when she handed it to him with a piece of Johnny cake, his face lit up with a joy that made her throat tighten. "Appreciate this more than I can say," Ephraim said, eating quickly. "Caldwell's been around my place trying to buy my creek access. Offered me cash money plus whiskey and cartridges to sweeten the deal." "What did you tell him?" Chaska asked. "Told him I'd think on it." Ephraim wiped his mouth. "But I don't trust the man. He's got eyes like a snake, cold, you know." "He'll come back," Chaska said. "I know." Ephraim glanced at his boy. "I got 3 kids and a wife who's sick half the time. Can't afford to make enemies of the railroad, but can't afford to sell out my neighbors either. We'll figure something out," Chaska said, though Alice heard the uncertainty beneath the words. Dr. Whitlow came after dark on the 3rd day, slipping through the back gate like a man who didn't want to be seen. He was middle-aged with thinning hair and spectacles that sat crooked on his nose. He carried a worn leather medical bag that smelled of carbolic acid and iodine. He examined Chaska's fever with quick efficiency, checking his pulse, looking at his eyes and tongue. "The fever's chronic," he said finally. "Damage from exposure, probably complicated by pneumonia, that never quite resolved. The tremor will likely persist, it's nerve damage. But if you rest when you can keep warm and take willow bark tea when it flares up, you should be able to manage it." "Can't rest much," Chaska said. "I know, but try." Whitlow turned to Alice, examining Jack with the same efficient care. "He's underweight, but not dangerously so. Keep him warm, keep feeding him, and he should be fine." He looked at Alice directly. I heard in town that Caldwell's been asking about a woman traveling with a baby. Says she's got railroad property that needs returning. Alice felt her stomach tighten. He's lying. I assumed as much. Whitlow adjusted his crooked spectacles. But you should know he's got Deputy Bragg asking questions too. If they come out here with a warrant, real or fabricated, I won't be able to help you much. Understood, Alice said. Miriam Lyle arrived on the morning of the 5th day, riding a gray mare and carrying her ledger in a leather satchel. She was a stern-faced woman in her 40s, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that missed nothing. "You're the widow Hart," Miriam said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Miriam studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. "Then you know what kind of men they are, what they're capable of." "I'm learning." "Good. Keep learning. Stay alert." She paused. "I'm an itinerant teacher. I also keep records, births, deaths, land transactions, anything that might matter later when there are disputes." "Why are you telling me this?" Alice asked. "Because records are power," Miriam said simply. "And because if you need help, if you need someone who knows how to navigate territorial law and who has connections to people in offices that matter, you come to the schoolhouse." Before she left, Miriam pulled Alice aside. "Your husband, Henry Hart. I remember when the news came through. The railroad said it was an accidental drowning, but there were rumors." She paused. Rumors that he'd been asking questions about the survey routes, that he'd refused to falsify reports, that Caldwell had threatened him. Alice felt something cold settle in her chest. "What kind of rumors?" "The kind people whisper but don't say outright," Miriam replied. "The kind that suggest maybe the drowning wasn't as accidental as the railroad claimed. But rumors aren't proof." "He was important to me." Alice said, her voice tight. "I know. And if you have proof, real proof of wrongdoing, then maybe we can make sure his death meant something." Miriam squeezed her arm briefly. "Be careful. Caldwell's a dangerous man." On the morning of the 7th day, Silas Caldwell came with his men. Alice was at the fire stirring a pot of stew. Jack sat in a wooden crate, padded with folded blankets, chewing contentedly on a leather strap. Chaska was near the corral mending fence, his hands moving with careful deliberation. The sound of hooves brought both their heads up. 4 riders approached from town, moving at an easy pace that spoke of confidence. Caldwell led them, his bulk, unmistakable, a big man, going soft but still powerful. The other 3 were hired men, rough types with gun belts and hard faces. Alice recognized one of them from the first day, the tobacco-stained one with the patchy beard. Chaska set down his tools and walked to the gate, positioning himself squarely in the opening. Alice moved toward the fire, her hand instinctively reaching for the carpet bag, where it sat tucked behind a water barrel. Caldwell dismounted with a grunt. He was dressed in a suit coat despite the morning heat, the fabric expensive but straining across his shoulders and stained with sweat under the arms. His face was florid red and swollen with small eyes that gleamed with calculation. "Morning," he said, his tone affable. "Heard you hired yourself a cook. That's good. A man shouldn't have to fend for himself out here." Chaska didn't reply. Caldwell glanced past him at Alice, and she saw his gaze sharpen. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his bowler hat. "Name's Silas Caldwell. I work for the Union Pacific Railroad. I'm the regional foreman. You look mighty familiar. Have we met before?" Alice kept her expression neutral. "I don't believe so." "Huh." Caldwell scratched his jaw. "Funny thing that. Could swear I've seen you somewhere. Maybe Cheyenne Fort Laramie?" "I haven't been to Laramie," Alice said, the lie smooth. Caldwell studied her a moment longer, his small eyes moving from her face to the carpet bag, visible behind the barrel, then back. She saw recognition flicker there. He turned back to Chaska. "Reason I'm here is business. The railroad's looking to expand through this territory. We need right-of-way access, and your land sits on some prime creek access. We'd like to come to an arrangement." "No," Chaska said flatly. Caldwell chuckled. "Now hold on. You haven't even heard the terms yet. We're talking about fair compensation cash money. All we need is access to the creek for our construction crews. Simple as that. The creek feeds my camp." Chaska said, his voice level but hard underneath. "Feeds the camps downstream. You take the water, we have nothing, so no." "That's not how it would work," Caldwell said, his tone growing more patronizing. "We'd just be running a line nearby. The treaty situation's a bit messy, but this arrangement would simplify everything." "The treaty says the water's protected," Chaska said. "Says it's for reservation use. That's clear enough." "Treaties are documents," Caldwell said, his smile thinning. "Documents get interpreted, get updated. Right now, the interpretation that matters is the one that says progress trumps outdated agreements." One of the hired men spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Maybe he don't understand English so good." Chaska's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. Caldwell waved a hand dismissively. "No call for rudeness." He took a step closer. "But the point stands. Railroads coming through no matter what. Question is whether you're on the side that benefits or the side that gets rolled over." His eyes drifted again to the carpet bag. "That's a nice bag you got there, ma'am. I notice it's got a particular kind of cord that's railway issue. We give bags like that to our survey crews. Had a surveyor working for me carried a bag just like that. Fellow by the name of Hart, Henry Hart. You wouldn't happen to know him, would you?" Alice felt her mouth go dry. "It's a common style. I bought it at a general store in Cheyenne." "Did you now?" Caldwell's smile widened. "Well, that's interesting because Hart's widow disappeared a few weeks back. Took some railway property with her survey journal's maps. Property that belongs to the Union Pacific. Now, I'm not saying you're Hart's widow. I'm just saying it's a mighty interesting coincidence." "Coincidences happen," Alice said. "They do," Caldwell agreed. "But when too many coincidences pile up, they usually mean something more than chance." He took another step forward, his hand reaching toward the gate latch. "Maybe I should just take a look in that bag." Chaska moved his hand, closing around the barrel of his rifle. He didn't lift it, didn't point it, but the intent was unmistakable. Caldwell stopped. For a long moment, the air stretched tight and dangerous. The hired men shifted hands, drifting toward their guns. Then Caldwell smiled slow and unpleasant. "No need to get excited, just making conversation." He stepped back, hands rising in mockery of surrender. "I'm sure we'll be seeing each other again real soon. Maybe next time under more official circumstances." He swung back into his saddle. "You think on what I said. Railroads coming one way or another. Problems tend to get solved, usually the hard way." The four men rode off, taking their time. Alice noticed they kept looking back, marking the camp's layout, assessing strengths and weaknesses. Chaska watched until they were out of sight, then let out a long breath. His hands were shaking harder than usual, and when he tried to bend down, his knees nearly buckled. Alice was there in 3 steps, steadying him. "Inside. You need to rest." "Need to finish the fence," he said weakly. "The fence can wait." She guided him toward the lodge. Jack started fussing, but she called over her shoulder, "Just a minute, sweet boy." Inside, she helped him sit, and made him drink willow bark tea while his hands shook so hard the cup rattled. He recognized the bag. Chaska said. I know. Alice sat back. And he'll be back, with more men probably, maybe with Deputy Bragg and a warrant. The journal, Chaska said. What's in it? Alice fetched the carpetbag and pulled out the journal. She opened it carefully and showed him a page. See these survey markers, coordinates for the proposed railway route? And these triangles, those are Henry's notation for sacred sites. Places marked on treaty maps as burial grounds that are supposed to be protected. Chaska leaned forward, scanning the page. He recognized some of the landmarks, the rock formation near the old winter camp, the creek bend, where his grandfather had taught him to fish the ridge, where generations of his family had left offerings. This route goes straight through the old burial grounds, he said, voice tight with anger. Right through the center. I know, Alice said. She flipped to another page with Henry's margin notes. And look at this. She pointed to cramped handwriting C. Insists Route 3 despite objections. Says burial mounds are just rocks and old bones. Ordered me to revise maps. I refused. He threatened termination. Jensen implied termination might mean more than losing job. Your husband tried to stop them, Chaska said quietly. He tried. Alice's voice caught. And they killed him for it. I'm sure of that now. They made it look like an accident, but they killed him because he wouldn't falsify the reports. Chaska looked up at her, seeing the grief and rage in her expression. And now they want this. Want to destroy the evidence. Yes. She closed the journal. So we can't let them have it. No matter what. We won't, Chaska said. He reached out and took her hand, steadying it, despite his own tremor. We'll figure this out. Alice looked at their joined hands, at the way his calloused fingers wrapped around hers with surprising gentleness. She felt something shift in her chest, something warm and frightening and unexpected. Thank you, she said quietly, for not turning me away, for standing with me. You came here needing help, Chaska replied. That's enough reason. But also this is my land, my family's land. Caldwell wants to take it, it wants to destroy what's sacred. So stopping him, that's not just helping you. That's protecting what's mine. Alice nodded, understanding. Then we fight. Then we fight, Chaska agreed. Outside, Jack's crying escalated. Alice squeezed Chaska's hand once more, then rose to tend to her son. As she nursed Jack, she thought about Caldwell's face, about the cold calculation she'd seen there. They were out of time for hiding. Now it was only a question of who would move first. She looked down at Jack and felt fierce protectiveness surge through her. I won't let them take you. Whatever it takes, we survive this. Over the following days, Alice and Chaska worked on making copies of the journal. Alice wrote in tiny, cramped handwriting, filling sheets of paper Miriam had left behind, then moving to the blank pages at the back of Chaska's account books. She copied coordinate sketches, Henry's marginal notes, everything needed to prove the case against Caldwell. Chaska helped when his hands were steady enough copying simpler sketches, while Alice focused on written content. They worked mostly in silence, only sounds being Jack's occasional fussing and the scratch of pen on paper. By the second day of copying, they'd produced 3 sets of documents, not complete copies, but comprehensive excerpts containing all critical evidence. Alice rolled them carefully and wrapped them in oilcloth to protect against moisture. As evening fell, Chaska came to sit beside her bringing coffee. He handed her a cup, and she took it gratefully, her hand cramping from the hours of writing. Your husband, Chaska said after a moment. What was he like? Alice was surprised by the question, the first personal thing Chaska had asked her. She sipped the coffee, thinking how to answer. He was kind, she said finally. Gentle, the kind of man who'd carry spiders outside rather than kill them. He loved his work, loved the precision of surveying the way mathematics could describe the world. But he also loved the land, itself respected it. He wasn't like the men he worked for. How did you meet? I was 17. He came to survey a new road through the county where I grew up. Stayed at my father's farm. We took in boarders for extra money. He and I would talk in the evenings, and he'd show me his maps, explain the calculations. She smiled faintly. My father didn't approve, thought Henry was too educated for a farmer's daughter. But Henry didn't care about that. He just cared that I was interested. You loved him, Chaska said. I did. Alice felt tears prick her eyes, but blinked them back. Still do, I suppose. You don't stop loving someone just because they die. But the grief changes, gets less sharp, and life keeps going whether you're ready for it or not. Chaska nodded slowly. I lost my wife 4 years ago. Pneumonia. She was sick for 2 weeks, and then she was gone. Left me with a camp to run and no idea how to do it alone. Alice looked at him in surprise. He'd never mentioned having been married. I'm sorry. So am I. He stared into his coffee. For a long time, I thought about giving up. Letting the camp fall apart, letting the government take what they wanted. But then I'd wake up and the sun would still be there and the horses would need feeding and the day would have work that needed doing. So I did it. And eventually, it got easier. Not easy, but easier. They sat in companionable silence, the shared understanding of loss and survival, creating a bridge between them that needed no more words. Finally, Alice said, "Thank you for letting me stay, for helping me fight this." "Yes, I did," Chaska said simply. "It's my fight, too." He rose, taking their empty cups, and paused. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for. Whatever happens with Caldwell with all of this, you'll survive it. Both of you will." Alice felt something warm bloom in her chest at his words. Not the desperate love she'd felt for Henry, but something different. Something steadier, forged from mutual respect and shared struggle. "So will you," she said quietly. Chaska's mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "We'll see." The fence line raid came on a moonless night, 5 days after Caldwell's visit. Alice woke to the sharp crack of wire snapping like a gunshot in the stillness. Chaska was already on his feet, rifle in hand, moving toward the door. "Stay with Jack," he said. But Alice grabbed the carpetbag and followed him outside. In the darkness, she could hear horses and voices, men laughing as they worked the metallic sound of wire cutters. A figure emerged from the shadows, Harlan Dade, the White Scout, who'd been coming around more frequently. He'd been watching from the ridge, he explained breathlessly, and had seen Caldwell's men cutting fence. 3 of them, Harlan said. "Maybe 4, trying to scatter your cattle." Chaska and Harlan moved toward the fence line, rifles ready. Alice stayed behind with Jack, but she could hear the confrontation shouting a warning shot fired into the air, then the sound of horses retreating at a gallop. When Chaska and Harlan returned, both were breathing hard. Chaska's hands were shaking badly, the fever clearly taking its toll. "They're gone for now," Harlan said, "but they'll be back. And next time they'll bring more men." Alice helped Chaska inside, forcing him to rest while she made willow bark tea. Harlan crouched by the fire, his expression troubled. "There's something you need to know," he said finally. "I've been working for Caldwell. He's been paying me to scout this territory to report on who's likely to resist when the railroad comes through." Alice felt her blood run cold. "You're spying for him." "Was," Harlan corrected. "But I'm done with that. Caldwell's planning something big. He's got dynamite, and he's talking about collapsing the creek bed at the marker points. Wants to bury the evidence before any federal inspector arrives. When? Chaska asked. Soon, maybe a week. Alice looked at Chaska, then back at Harlan. Well, why are you telling us this? Why betray Caldwell now? Harlan was silent for a moment. Because I've seen what he does to people who get in his way. Seen how he uses them up and throws them away. And I'm tired of being part of that. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket. Found this on one of his foremen last night. Thought you should see it. He handed the paper to Alice. It was a page torn from a ledger, covered in cramped handwriting and columns of figures. At the top, payments discretionary funds. Alice unfolded it, her hands trembling. The entries were dates and amounts, and beside each was a name Bragg. Whitlow, Ephraim Pike, H. Dade. Her stomach dropped. Whitlow. Harlan nodded grimly. He's on the list. Took $50 last month. Another $30 before. That can't be right, Alice said. He's been helping us. Maybe he has, Harlan said. Or maybe he's playing both sides. Caldwell does that pays people enough to keep them quiet, but not enough to buy loyalty. Makes them nervous. Chaska studied the page. What about the rest? Harlan pointed to another entry. That's me. Caldwell paid me to scout your land report on your defenses. I took his money because I needed it, and because I figured I could use the information to help you instead. But now he's got it in writing. Alice read further down the page. At the bottom, almost hidden among the figures, was a line in smaller handwriting, survey completion, Route 3 confirmed. Inspector notified, awaiting final approval. H. Hart contract terminated. She looked up sharply. When was this dated? Harlan leaned over to check. 3 weeks before your husband died. 3 weeks. Alice repeated, her voice shaking. She turned to Chaska. This ledger says the survey was completed 3 weeks before Henry drowned, and the inspector was notified. The work was done. Henry had finished. So why kill him? Harlan asked. Alice felt pieces clicking into place, cold and terrible. Because he was the only witness. He knew about the illegal routes, had documented everything. As long as he was alive, he could testify against Caldwell. But once he was dead, there was no one left who could prove what Caldwell ordered. Except the journal. Chaska's face darkened. Contract terminated. That's not firing. That's murder, Alice said flatly. The word hung in the air, final and damning. Harlan looked between them. Caldwell's not just keeping records. He's using them. He's got a file on everyone he's ever paid, and he threatens to expose them unless they do what he wants. Alice felt cold rage settle over her. We need to confront Whitlow. Find out whose side he's really on. And we need to get this ledger page to Miriam, Chaska added. Combined with the journal, it's enough to prove Caldwell's not just violating treaty law, he's a murderer. Then we move fast, Harlan said. Because once Caldwell realizes this page is missing, he'll know someone's working against him, and he'll come down hard. They decided to split up. Alice would take the ledger page and one set of journal copies to Miriam at the schoolhouse. Chaska and Harlan would ride to confront Whitlow to determine whether the doctor was truly compromised or if there was an explanation for his name being on Caldwell's payment list. As dawn broke gray and cold, Alice wrapped Jack in his quilt and climbed into the buckboard. Chaska stood beside the wagon, his hand resting on the rail. Be careful, he said. You too. Alice looked down at him, at the exhaustion lining his face, at the tremor in his hands that he couldn't quite hide. On impulse, she reached down and touched his cheek, her fingers gentle against his jaw. Don't take unnecessary risks. Come back." Chaska covered her hand with his briefly, and she felt the warmth of his palm and the steadiness he forced into the contact despite the fever. "I will." She drove toward town, Jack sleeping against her chest, the ledger page and journal copies hidden beneath the seat. Behind her, Chaska and Harlan mounted their horses and rode in the opposite direction toward Whitlow's office. The confrontation with Whitlow was tense and explosive. They found him in his back room treating a miner's broken finger, and when Harlan showed him the ledger page with his name on it, the doctor's face went pale. "I can explain," Whitlow said, setting down his instruments with shaking hands. "Then explain." Chaska said, his voice hard. Whitlow sank onto a stool, suddenly looking older than his years. "Caldwell came to me 6 months ago. Said he knew I'd been treating reservation families without charging them. Said that was interfering with railroad business because healthy workers were less desperate, less willing to take dangerous jobs for low pay. He threatened to report me to the Territorial Medical Board, have my license revoked for treating Indians without proper authorization." "So you took his money," Harlan said. "I took his money to keep him quiet," Whitlow corrected. "And then I used that money to buy medicine for the families I was treating, medicine I couldn't afford otherwise. Every dollar he gave me went right back into supplies." He looked at Chaska. "I never told him anything useful. Never reported on your camp, never gave him information he could use against you. I just took his money and let him think he'd bought me." "Can you prove that?" Chaska asked. "I have receipts. Dates match up with his payments. Every time he gave me money, I bought supplies within a day or two. It's all documented." Whitlow stood moving to a locked cabinet and pulling out a ledger of his own. "Here, check for yourselves." Harlan took the ledger and flipped through it, comparing dates. After a long moment, he nodded. "He's telling the truth. Every payment from Caldwell matches up with purchases: quinine, carbolic acid, bandages, surgical thread. Nothing personal." Chaska felt some of the tension ease from his shoulders. "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because I was ashamed," Whitlow said bluntly. "Because I took money from a man I despise, even if it was for a good cause. And because I didn't want to compromise you by association. The less you knew about my arrangement with Caldwell, the safer you were." "That changes now," Chaska said. "We need you on our side openly. Alice is taking evidence to Miriam, the journal, and this ledger page. We're going to expose Caldwell, stop the railroad route, and make sure he faces justice for murdering Henry Hart." Whitlow straightened, something hardening in his expression. "Then I'm with you. Whatever you need." "Good," Harlan said, "because Caldwell's going to move soon, and when he does, we'll need every ally we can get." They rode back toward Chaska's camp, but before they arrived, they saw smoke rising from the direction of Ephraim Pike's homestead, thick black smoke that spoke of something burning out of control. They spurred their horses faster, dread building in Chaska's chest. When they crested the rise overlooking Ephraim's land, they saw the devastation. The fence was gone, not just cut, but burned, the posts reduced to charred stumps, and the wire melted into twisted metal. The small barn where Ephraim kept his tools and winter hay was engulfed in flames, and Ephraim himself lay in the dirt near the gate, his wife kneeling beside him, while their children huddled nearby, crying. Chaska was off his horse before it fully stopped running toward Ephraim. The farmer was conscious, but badly beaten. His face swollen and discolored blood, matting his hair, his breathing labored and wheezing. One eye was swollen completely shut, and when he tried to speak, blood bubbled from his split lips. "Caldwell's men," Ephraim's wife said, her voice shaking. "They came before dawn. Said Ephraim talked too much, needed to learn to keep his mouth shut. They beat him, then set fire to the fence and barn, said this was just a warning next time they'd burn the house with us inside. How many? Harlan asked. 4, maybe 5. Hard to tell in the dark. She looked at Chaska with hollow eyes. They knew about you. Said you were harboring a fugitive, said anyone who helped you would end up worse than Ephraim. Chaska felt cold rage wash over him. This was Caldwell's response to losing the ledger page, a brutal demonstration of what happened to those who stood against him. We need to get him to Whitlow, Harlan said, already moving back toward his horse. He needs medical attention now, or he's not going to make it. They rigged a travois from fence poles and blankets, loaded Ephraim onto it as gently as they could, and started the agonizing journey back toward town. Ephraim's oldest boy rode with them, his face set in lines too hard for a child, his hands gripping the travois ropes with white-knuckled determination. By the time they reached Whitlow's office, Alice had returned from the schoolhouse. She took one look at Ephraim and went pale. But she didn't hesitate. She helped Whitlow lift the farmer onto the examination table and began cutting away his blood-soaked shirt to assess the damage. Broken ribs, Whitlow said after a moment, his hands moving quickly over Ephraim's torso. At least 3, maybe 4. Possible internal bleeding, cracked jaw, concussion. He looked up, his face grim. He's lucky to be alive. Will he survive? Chaska asked. If infection doesn't set in and if he rests, but he's in no condition to be moved or to fight. He needs to stay here for at least a week, maybe 2. Alice stood back, her hands trembling with fury. She looked at Chaska, and he saw in her eyes the same cold rage he felt building in his own chest. This is what Caldwell does, she said, her voice low and dangerous. This is how he controls people, through fear and violence. And if we don't stop him now, he'll keep doing it until there's no one left willing to stand against him. Then we stop him, Chaska said. Now. No more waiting. Harlan stepped forward. Miriam's sending telegrams to the Territorial Office and the Federal Land Commission. But that takes time, days, maybe weeks, before anyone responds. We need to buy that time. How? Alice asked. By making it impossible for Caldwell to use the dynamite, Harlan said. If he can't collapse the creek bed and bury the evidence, then the markers will still be there when the inspector arrives. And with the journal and the ledger page, we'll have everything we need to stop him. He's got men guarding the dynamite, Chaska pointed out, and he knows we're working against him now. He'll be ready for us. Then we don't go in the way he expects, Harlan said. We wait for weather, a storm, something that'll give us cover, and we move fast, hit hard, and get out before he can respond. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Breath and rain were the only sounds. Alice looked at Chaska. What do you think? Chaska was silent for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision. They were talking about open confrontation with Caldwell and his hired guns, a fight that could get them all killed. But Ephraim's battered face, his labored breathing, his wife's hollow eyes, those told him that doing nothing was no longer an option. I think we do it, he said finally. But we do it smart. We get help from everyone we can, Miriam, anyone she trusts who's willing to stand with us. We make sure the journal and ledger copies are hidden in multiple places so Caldwell can't destroy all the evidence. And we wait for the right moment. The right moment being? Alice asked. A storm, Chaska said. The kind that'll keep Caldwell's men scattered and give us a chance to move without being seen until we're right on top of them. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Breath and rain were the only sounds. Harlan nodded slowly. Could work. But we'd need to be ready to move fast when the weather turns. "Then we get ready," Alice said. "Starting now." They spent the next 2 days preparing. Miriam distributed copies of the journal and ledger page to trusted contacts, a clerk in the land office who owed her a favor, a ranch owner who'd lost land to railroad schemes, a minister who kept records in his church basement. No single location held all the evidence, but together the scattered pieces formed an unbreakable chain of a proof. Whitlow tended to Ephraim, keeping him stable and hidden in the back room of his office. Ephraim's oldest boy refused to leave standing guard outside with a determination that broke Alice's heart. Chaska spent the time checking weapons and equipment, preparing for the confrontation he knew was coming. His hands shook constantly now, the fever and stress combining to make even simple tasks difficult. But he pushed through it, forcing steadiness where his body wanted to betray him. Alice watched him struggle and felt her heart ache. One evening, when he was trying unsuccessfully to clean his rifle, and the tremor made him drop the ramrod. For the third time, she went to him and gently took the weapon from his hands. "Let me," she said. "I can do it." Chaska protested, but his voice was weak. "I know you can, but you don't have to do everything alone." She began cleaning the rifle with efficient movements, and after a moment Chaska sank onto the pallet beside her, exhaustion written in every line of his body. "I'm afraid I'll fail when it matters," he admitted quietly. "That when we face Caldwell, the fever will come on and I'll be useless. That I'll get you killed because my hands won't work when I need them to." Alice set down the rifle and turned to face him. "You've never failed me yet. Not once. You stood between me and those riders on the first day. You've protected this camp and fought for your land, despite fever and drought and a government that wants you gone. You're the strongest man I know." "I don't feel strong," Chaska said. "Strength isn't about not being afraid or not being hurt," Alice said. "It's about keeping going despite those things. And that's what you do. Every single day." She reached out and took his hand, feeling the tremor there, and held it steady between both of hers. "Whatever happens when we face Caldwell, we face it together. Your strength and mine. And that's enough." Chaska looked at their joined hands and then up at her face, and something shifted in his expression, something warm and vulnerable that he'd been keeping carefully hidden. "You matter to me," he said quietly. "You and Jack both. More than I expected. More than I probably should let myself feel." Alice felt her breath catch. "You matter to me too. More than I thought possible after Henry. I didn't think I could feel this way about anyone again." "But you do?" Chaska asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I do," Alice said. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his, breathing in the scent of sage and smoke and something uniquely him. "I do." They sat like that for a long moment, the world narrowing to just the two of them and the warmth where their bodies touched. Then Jack woke with a cry, breaking the spell, and Alice pulled back to tend to her son. But something had changed between them. A barrier crossed, an acknowledgement made. And when Chaska looked at her across the fire that evening, his eyes held a promise that needed no words. The storm came on the third day, rolling in from the west, with a wall of black clouds that turned afternoon to premature twilight. Alice felt it in the air, first a change in pressure that made her skin prickle and her breath come short. The wind picked up, whipping through the camp and rattling the lodge poles. Lightning flickered on the horizon, and thunder followed seconds later, a low rumble that spoke of violence building. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Breath and rain were the only sounds. Harlan arrived within the hour, his horse lathered and breathing hard. "Caldwell's moving," saw his crew loading the dynamite onto wagons heading toward the creek. They're going to do it tonight, use the storm as cover. Alice felt her pulse quicken. This was it, the moment they'd been preparing for. We need to stop them. Miriam's gathering people at the schoolhouse, Harlan said. Everyone she could trust who's willing to stand against Caldwell. But even with them, we're outnumbered. Then we'll have to be smarter, Chaska said. He was already checking his rifle, his hands steadier than they'd been in days, adrenaline and purpose forcing the tremor into submission. Harlan, you know where they're setting up? The creek bend near Marker 7, where the old burial mounds are. They'll plant charges there, and at Marker 12 the spring. If they blow both, they'll collapse half the creek bed and make it look like natural erosion. Then we split up, Chaska said. Half our people go to Marker 7, half to Marker 12. We stop them from detonating the charges, and we hold them off until we can get word to the territorial marshal. Bragg's still in Caldwell's pocket, Harlan warned. Then we go over his head. Alice said. Miriam sent telegrams to Fort Keogh and the territorial capital. If we can hold Caldwell off for even one day, the cavalry arrives, and it's over. The first drops of rain began to fall fat and heavy, striking like bullets against the dusty ground. Within minutes, it was a downpour, turning the camp paths to mud and reducing visibility to a few dozen yards. Perfect, Harlan said with grim satisfaction. Caldwell's men won't be able to see us coming until we're right on top of them. They gathered what forces they had: Chaska, Alice, Harlan, Whitlow, who insisted on coming despite his age, Miriam, and 3 homesteaders she'd convinced to join them. Ephraim's oldest boy appeared carrying his father's rifle, his jaw set with determination that wouldn't be argued with. Your father needs you here, Alice tried. My father needs Caldwell stopped, the boy countered. I'm coming. They divided into 2 groups. Chaska, Alice, Harlan, and 2 homesteaders would head to Marker 7, the main site where Caldwell would likely be directing operations. Miriam, Whitlow, the boy, and the remaining homesteader would go to Marker 12 to prevent the secondary detonation. Before they separated, Chaska pulled Alice aside. Rain plastered her hair to her face, and in the lightning flashes, her eyes looked dark and determined. If something happens, he started. Nothing's going to happen, Alice interrupted. But if it does, Chaska persisted. I need you to know. I already know, Alice said. She reached up and pulled him down, kissing him hard and fast, tasting rain and fear and something fierce that had been building between them for weeks. When she pulled back, his eyes were wide with surprise. Now let's go stop Caldwell so we can have time to talk about it later. A ghost of a smile touched Chaska's lips. Yes, ma'am. They rode hard through the storm, the rain lashing at them with increasing violence. The creek was already rising, swollen with runoff from the hills, and the trail along its bank had turned treacherous with mud and debris. When they reached Marker 7, they could see Caldwell's operation through the sheets of rain. 4 wagons positioned near the creek bend, men struggling to unload crates of dynamite and set charges against the exposed rock face where the burial mounds sat. Lanterns swung in the wind, casting crazy shadows, and Caldwell's bulk was unmistakable in the center of it all, shouting orders that were barely audible over the storm. At least a dozen men, Harlan counted. Maybe more in the wagons. We need to get to those charges, Chaska said. If they light the fuses before we can stop them. They won't, Alice said with more confidence than she felt. She had Jack strapped to her chest beneath her oilskin coat, and the baby was blessedly quiet, either sleeping through the chaos or too frightened to cry. They approached on foot, leaving the horses tied in a ravine and moving through the sage and rock outcroppings that bordered the creek. The storm provided cover, but it also made movement treacherous. Loose stones turned under their feet, and the rain made everything slick and dangerous. They got within 50 yards before someone spotted them, one of Caldwell's men turning just as lightning illuminated the landscape. His shout of alarm barely audible over the thunder. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Breath and rain were the only sounds. "Now!" Harlan shouted, and chaos erupted. Harlan fired first a warning shot that struck the ground near Caldwell's feet. The foreman spun his face, contorting with rage, and pointed toward them. His men scattered, drawing weapons, and suddenly the night was full of gunfire and shouting. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Breath and rain were the only sounds. Alice dropped flat behind a boulder, shielding Jack with her body. A bullet whined past her head close enough that she felt the displacement of air. Beside her, Chaska was returning fire. His movements mechanical and precise, despite the tremor she could see, even in the dim light. One of Caldwell's men went down, clutching his leg. Another dove behind a wagon. The homesteaders were firing from different positions, trying to create crossfire, trying to pin down Caldwell's men so they couldn't complete the charges. But Caldwell himself was moving toward the largest charge, a cluster of dynamite sticks bundled together near the base of the rock face. Even through the rain, Alice could see the fuse coiled beside it, ready to be lit. "He's going for the charges," she shouted. Chaska saw it too. He broke from cover, running low and fast, across open ground, toward where Caldwell was reaching for a match safe in his coat pocket. Alice's heart stopped. He was completely exposed, an easy target, and she saw at least 2 of Caldwell's men turn their rifles toward him. She fired without thinking, her shot wild but close enough to make one of the men duck. Harlan took down the other with a precise shot that sent the man spinning into the mud. Chaska reached Caldwell just as the foreman struck a match. They collided hard, both men going down in a tangle of limbs and mud. The match flew from Caldwell's hand, extinguished instantly by the rain. Alice ran toward them, Jack bouncing against her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She saw Chaska land a solid punch to Caldwell's face, saw the foreman's head snap back. But Caldwell was bigger, heavier, and he had advantages that Chaska's fever-weakened body couldn't match. Caldwell got his hands around Chaska's throat, his face twisted with fury. "Should have taken the money when I offered it, you stubborn fool. Should have just moved along like a good little Indian and let the adults do business." Chaska clawed at Caldwell's wrists, but his strength was fading, the lack of air, and the fever combining to sap his ability to fight. His vision was going dark at the edges, and he could feel his body starting to shut down. Then Caldwell turned his head and saw Alice approaching, and something vicious crossed his face. "Hart's widow. Of course you'd be here. Your husband was just as stubborn as this one. Kept insisting the Roots violated treaties, kept documenting everything like it mattered." He smiled, a terrible expression made worse by the blood streaming from his split lip. "He begged for his life at the end, you know. Cried and pleaded while we held him under the water. Said he had a wife and baby waiting for him. Said he'd destroy all his notes, forget everything he'd seen if we just let him live." Alice felt something inside her snap. She swung the rifle like a club, the stock connecting with Caldwell's temple, with a crack that was audible even over the storm. The foreman's grip on Chaska's throat loosened, and he toppled sideways into the mud. Chaska gasped for air, his hands going to his bruised throat. Alice dropped to her knees beside him, one hand checking him for injuries, while the other kept the rifle trained on Caldwell. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice shaking. Chaska nodded, still unable to speak. He pushed himself to his knees, then saw what Alice had already spotted, the fuse. In the struggle, Caldwell's coat had fallen open, revealing not matches, but a cigar lit and protected in a metal case clearly intended for lighting the charges. And the fuse was within reach of the fallen cigar case. which had tumbled from Caldwell's pocket and landed in a puddle that was rapidly deepening with rain. "The charges," Alice said. They both moved at once, scrambling through the mud toward the bundled dynamite. The fuse was still dry beneath an overhang of rock protected from the worst of the rain. Alice could see it was waxed, designed to burn. Even in wet conditions, railroad quality meant to be reliable. Chaska pulled out his knife. Henry's knife, Alice realized the one she'd given him days ago, and began sawing at the fuse. But his hands were shaking violently now, the combination of fever oxygen deprivation and adrenaline making fine motor control nearly impossible. The knife slipped, nicking his palm, and he swore. "Here," Alice said, taking the knife, but she couldn't hold it steady either. Her own hands were shaking from cold and fear and rage, and with Jack strapped to her chest, she couldn't get the angle she needed. They looked at each other, and without words understood. Alice gripped Chaska's wrist, steadying his hand with both of hers, guiding the knife blade to the fuse. Together, their hands overlapping, they sawed at the waxed cord, while seconds ticked past that felt like hours. Around them, the firefight continued. Harlan was holding off 3 of Caldwell's men, firing and moving, firing and moving. The homesteaders had pinned down 2 more behind a wagon. But Alice was aware of none of it. Her entire world had narrowed to the fuse, the knife in Chaska's hand beneath hers. The fuse severed with a quiet sound that was nevertheless the most beautiful thing Alice had ever heard. She and Chaska sat back, breathing hard, and looked at each other through the rain and darkness. "Together," Chaska said hoarsely. "Together." Alice agreed. But they weren't done. Caldwell, dazed and bleeding from where Alice had struck him, was crawling toward them. In his hand was a Derringer, a small hideout gun that Alice hadn't known he carried. "You don't understand." Caldwell slurred his words thick from the blow to his head. "This is progress. This is the future. Your husband understood that eventually, which is why he had to—" The rest of his words were lost in a tremendous crack of thunder, and suddenly the earth itself seemed to move. The creek bank, undermined by the rising water and destabilized by Caldwell's digging around the charge placement, gave way in a massive slump. Caldwell, positioned directly on the crumbling edge, had no chance to move. His horse spooked by the noise, and lightning reared and came down hard, its hooves striking Caldwell's legs. The foreman's scream was audible even over the storm, a sound of pure agony as bones shattered. He fell backward, the Derringer firing harmlessly into the air, and his body landed half in the water, half on the collapsing bank. Alice and Chaska scrambled back from the edge as more earth gave way. Below them, they could hear Caldwell's men shouting in panic, abandoning their positions and running for higher ground as the flooded creek threatened to wash away the entire operation site. Harlan appeared beside them, water streaming from his hat. "We need to move. The whole bank's going." They retreated to solid ground, joining the homesteaders on a rocky outcropping above the creek. Below, Caldwell's men were in full rout, some trying to salvage the dynamite crates, others simply running for their lives. The wagons were mired in mud, and one had already tipped over, spilling its contents into the rising water. In the chaos, Deputy Bragg appeared, having been watching from a distance. Alice realized with disgust. But as Bragg moved toward where Caldwell lay screaming, Harlan intercepted him. "Look at this," Harlan shouted over the storm, shoving the ledger page into Bragg's face. "Look at what he paid you. It's all here, every bribe, every illegal payment. And look at this line, Hart contract terminated. That's murder, Bragg. You're an accessory to murder." Bragg stared at the page, his face going pale, even in the darkness. He looked at Caldwell, and then at the wreckage of the operation, and then back at the ledger. "It's over," Harlan said, not unkindly. "Caldwell's done. The only question is whether you go down with him or whether you help us finish this right." Bragg's shoulders sagged. Slowly he pulled handcuffs from his belt, then moved toward where several of Caldwell's men had been corralled by the homesteaders. "You're under arrest," he said, his voice carrying more authority than Alice had ever heard from him. "All of you, for destruction of federal property, violation of treaty law, and conspiracy to commit murder." The fight went out of Caldwell's men then. They were cold, wet, outnumbered, and their employer was lying in the mud with his legs crushed beneath a horse screaming for help that was slow in coming. They dropped their weapons and allowed themselves to be restrained. Caldwell himself was in bad shape. When Whitlow finally reached him, having ridden hard from Marker 12, where Miriam's group had successfully prevented the second detonation, his assessment was grim. Both legs broken, multiple fractures, possible internal injuries from the fall. He needs surgery and a real hospital, not my back room. Whitlow looked at Bragg. "You'll have to arrange transport to Fort Keogh if he survives the trip." "Will he survive?" Bragg asked. "Probably," Whitlow said. "Though he'll never walk right again, and that's assuming infection doesn't set in." He paused, then added, "I'll do what I can, but I won't lie, part of me thinks he deserves worse." "He'll face justice," Bragg said quietly. "Real justice. I'll make sure of it." As dawn broke gray and cold over the devastated creek bank, with the storm finally passing and leaving mud and destruction in its wake, Alice stood beside Chaska and looked at what they'd accomplished. The charges had been cut. The evidence, both physical markers and documentary proof, remained intact. Caldwell and his men were in custody. And for the first time since Henry's death, Alice felt like she could breathe. Chaska put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, feeling Jack stir between them as the baby began to wake. They were battered, exhausted, covered in mud and rain, and they'd come within minutes of dying. But they'd won. "It's over," Chaska said softly. "It's over," Alice agreed. Then she looked up at him, at the bruises forming on his throat, at the exhaustion lining his face, and added, "And we survived. Together." "Together," Chaska echoed. He pulled her closer, and despite everything, the mud, the cold, the watching eyes of their allies, he kissed her. It was different from the desperate kiss before the battle, softer and deeper, a promise of things to come rather than a farewell. When they finally pulled apart, Jack was fussing loudly, demanding attention. Alice laughed, a sound that felt strange and wonderful after weeks of fear and tension, and began nursing him right there in the pre-dawn light, too tired and too relieved to care about propriety. Harlan approached, looking as battered as the rest of them. Miriam sent word the federal inspector's arriving tomorrow. Got her telegram and rode all night from the territorial capital. He'll want to see the sites, examine the evidence. "He'll see it," Chaska said. "All of it. The markers, the journal, the ledger page. Everything we have. And Caldwell will face charges in federal court," Bragg said, joining them. He looked older, somehow diminished by his choices, but perhaps trying to redeem them. "Murder, bribery, destruction of federal property, violation of treaty law. If he survives his injuries, he'll spend the rest of his life in prison." "Good," Alice said simply. She had no more words for Caldwell, no more energy to spend on hating him. Henry was gone, and no punishment would bring him back. But at least his death would mean something. At least the evidence he died protecting would finally be used. The federal inspector arrived exactly when promised, a thin, efficient man named Morrison, with wire-rimmed spectacles and a leather portfolio full of documents. He spent 2 days examining the creek sites, comparing the physical markers to Henry's journal entries, cross-referencing the survey maps with the original treaty documents. On the 3rd day, he called a meeting at the Red Mesa courthouse, a cramped building that served as courtroom, land office, and town hall all at once. Every seat was filled with people standing in the aisles and crowding the doorway. Word had spread of what had happened at the creek, and the territory's residents wanted to see justice done. Morrison stood at the front, his portfolio open on the judge's bench. After thorough examination of the evidence presented, including the journal of surveyor Henry Hart, the ledger page documenting illegal payments, the testimony of multiple witnesses, and physical inspection of the protected sites, I am issuing the following findings. He put on his spectacles and read from a prepared document. First, the proposed railway route designated as Route 3 is in direct violation of the Treaty of 1868, a clause which specifically protects burial sites and ceremonial grounds from disturbance or development. The triangular markers documented by Surveyor Hart correspond exactly to sites listed in the original treaty maps. A murmur ran through the crowd. Morrison raised his hand for silence and continued. Second, Silas Caldwell, as regional foreman for the Union Pacific Railroad, knowingly ordered his surveyors to falsify reports and omit protected sites from official documentation. This constitutes fraud against the federal government. Third evidence suggests that Surveyor Henry Hart was murdered to prevent him from reporting these violations to federal authorities. While Caldwell maintains his innocence testimony from multiple witnesses, including former employee Harlan Dade, combined with the notation in Caldwell's ledger reading, H. Hart contract terminated, dated 3 weeks before Hart's death, provides sufficient grounds for murder charges to proceed. Alice felt tears stream down her face. This was an official acknowledgement that Henry had been murdered, that his death hadn't been an accident. She felt Chaska's hand find hers and hold tight. Fourth, Morrison continued, all work on Route 3 is permanently halted. The railway will be required to submit alternative routes that do not violate treaty protections. Furthermore, the Union Pacific Railroad will be fined $50,000 for violations already committed and will face additional penalties if any further violations are discovered. The crowd erupted in applause and shouts. Morrison had to bang the judge's gavel repeatedly to restore order. Finally, he said, when quiet had been restored, I am recommending that the creek bed and surrounding lands be designated as permanently protected under federal supervision to prevent future violations. The water rights remain with the reservation communities as specified in the original treaty. He closed his portfolio and looked out over the assembled crowd. Justice delayed is justice denied. But in this case, justice has finally been served. Thanks to the courage of those who stood against corruption and violence, the law has been upheld. This court is adjourned. As people filed out talking excitedly and making plans, Alice stood in the aisle, unable to move. It was over. Truly over. Henry's death had been acknowledged and avenged. The land was protected. Caldwell would face trial for murder. Ma'am. Morrison approached her, his severe expression softening slightly. You're Alice Hart, Henry Hart's widow. Yes, Alice said. Your husband was a brave man, a good surveyor, and a better person. His documentation was meticulous. It made my job considerably easier. Morrison reached into his portfolio and pulled out an envelope. This was in the Federal Land Office files, but it was never forwarded to the railroad, as it should have been. I believe you should have it. Alice took the envelope with trembling hands. It was addressed to Henry from the Federal Surveyor's Office in Washington, dated a month before his death. She opened it carefully and read, Dear Mr. Hart, we are in receipt of your report regarding proposed Route 3 through reservation land in Wyoming Territory. After careful review of your survey notes and comparison with original Treaty of 1868 maps, we must decline approval of this route. The triangular marker you have identified at coordinates 43.8 107.5 degree designates a sacred spring and burial site with protected status under federal law. Additionally, our review indicates this marker serves as a boundary designation for exclusive water rights granted to the Lakota Reservation under a clause of the Treaty of 1868. Please advise Mr. Caldwell that his claim to adjacent land is voided as the creek access falls under exclusive reservation use and may not be diverted or obstructed for commercial purposes. Furthermore, we are referring this matter to the Department of Justice for investigation into potential violations of treaty law and fraud against the federal government. Respectfully, Thomas Whitmore, Director, Federal Land Survey Office. Alice read the letter twice, then a third time, unable to quite believe what she was seeing. This letter, this official government document, confirmed everything. The creek was protected. The water rights were guaranteed. Caldwell's scheme had been illegal from the start. And Henry had known. Had tried to get this letter to the authorities, had documented everything had died, trying to protect these rights. "Thank you," she said to Morrison, her voice thick with tears. "Thank you for bringing this." "It's yours by right," Morrison said. "And Mrs. Hart, your husband's journal will be preserved in federal archives as evidence of his integrity and courage. His name will be cleared, and his work will be remembered." After Morrison left, Alice stood in the empty courthouse, holding the letter, feeling the weight of vindication and grief and relief all mixed together. Chaska approached quietly and read the letter over her shoulder. "It's finished," he said. "The land is safe. The water is protected, legally, permanently." "Henry did that," Alice said. "He made this happen even after death. The journal, the documentation, it all mattered." "And so did you," Chaska said. "You could have run, could have destroyed the journal to keep yourself safe. But you didn't. You fought." Alice folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket. "We fought, all of us." She looked up at him. "And now we can finally rest." But there was one more thing she needed to do. 3 days later, Alice stood at Henry's grave in the Territorial Cemetery in Cheyenne. It had taken a day's hard riding to get there, but she'd needed to come, needed to tell him what had happened. The grave was marked with a simple wooden cross, his name, and dates carved roughly into the wood. Someone, probably the undertaker, had planted wildflowers around it, and they'd gone to seed scattering in the wind. Alice knelt in the grass, Jack in her arms, and told Henry everything. About finding Chaska, about the fight with Caldwell, about the inspector's findings, and the letter from Washington. About justice finally being served. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you," she said quietly. "I'm sorry you died alone and afraid. But I promise you, your death wasn't meaningless. The land is protected. The people you tried to help are safe. And everyone knows you were a hero." Jack reached out toward the grave marker, his small hand opening and closing. Alice let him touch the wood, let him feel the carved letters of his father's name. "He would have been so proud of you," she told Jack. "Would have loved you so much. And even though he's gone, his love is still here, in the land he protected and the people he helped in you." She stood after a while, brushing grass from her skirt. Chaska was waiting at a respectful distance, leaning against the cemetery fence. When she walked toward him, he straightened and opened his arms, and she walked into his embrace, Jack between them. "Ready to go home?" he asked. "Home." The word settled over her like a blessing. "Yes," Alice said. "I'm ready." Late summer brought a reprieve from the drought, not heavy rains, but enough moisture to green the grass and swell the creek to sustainable levels. Chaska's vegetable patch flourished, and the corn that had looked so stunted in spring grew tall and produced good ears. The communal effort he'd organized with Ephraim and the other homesteaders succeeded beyond expectations. By pooling resources and labor, They'd managed to plant and harvest enough to see everyone through the coming winter, with food to spare. Ephraim recovered slowly but steadily, his broken ribs healing crooked but functional. His oldest boy had grown 2 inches over the summer and carried himself with a confidence he'd lacked before having faced down Caldwell's men would do that to a person. Miriam continued her teaching rounds, but she'd added a new component, legal literacy, teaching homesteaders and reservation families alike to read treaties and land documents to understand their rights under territorial and federal law. Knowledge was power, she insisted, and she was determined to arm her communities with both. Whitlow kept tending the sick, though his practice had grown considerably as word spread that he'd stood against the railroad. He no longer took payments from anyone with questionable motives, and his ledger showed every penny accounted for and explained. Harlan Dade had left the territory entirely, having testified at Caldwell's trial, and then moved on. He'd left behind a letter for Chaska, thanking him for showing him what integrity looked like, and apologizing for the years he'd spent on the wrong side of history. Caldwell himself had been convicted on all charges and sentenced to 20 years hard labor at the territorial prison. His legs had healed poorly, leaving him with a permanent limp and constant pain, a reminder, perhaps, of the people he'd hurt and the land he'd tried to destroy. And Alice and Chaska, they'd built something together that neither had expected. They'd married in September, a simple ceremony presided over by Miriam in her capacity as civil celebrant. There'd been no church, no fancy dress, just the two of them and Jack and the community they'd fought so hard to protect. Ephraim had stood as witness, his boy solemn and proud beside him. Miriam had recorded it in her ledger, with her usual precision, making it official and legal under territorial law. The old sign, "Want Cook," still hung on the gatepost, but now it served as a reminder rather than an advertisement. Alice had proposed taking it down, but Chaska had shaken his head. "Leave it," he'd said. "It brought you here, brought us together. And I want to remember that sometimes the thing you think you need isn't what you actually need at all." "What did you need?" Alice had asked, teasing. "You," Chaska had said simply. "And Jack, a family, a future. All the things I thought I'd lost when my wife died." Now, on a cool October evening, with the first frost threatening and the stars brilliant overhead, they sat together outside the main lodge. Jack was asleep inside, wrapped in quilts, growing strong and healthy in the high country air. Alice leaned against Chaska's shoulder, feeling his arm around her solid and steady. His tremor was still there, would always be there. Whitlow had confirmed, but it was manageable. And she'd learned to read when he needed rest and when he was pushing himself too hard. "Do you ever regret it?" Chaska asked quietly. "Giving up the chance to go back east to rebuild your life somewhere easier?" "No," Alice said without hesitation. "This is my life, here, with you, with Jack, with this community." She paused, then added, "Henry brought me west, but you gave me a reason to stay. And I choose this. Choose us. Every day." Chaska pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I choose us too." Inside the lodge, Jack stirred and made a small sound. Alice rose to check on him, but he'd merely rolled over in his sleep, his small hand curling around the edge of his blanket. She watched him for a moment, thinking about Henry and all he'd sacrificed, about the future he'd died protecting. "Thank you," she whispered to the darkness, to Henry's memory, to whatever force had brought her to this place against all odds. "Thank you for Jack. Thank you for the journal. Thank you for showing me what integrity looks like, even when it costs everything." She returned to Chaska, and he pulled her down beside him again. They sat in companionable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, listening to the distant sound of the creek flowing strong and clear through the protected land. The drought would come again. Droughts always did in this country. Winters would be hard. The government would try again to redraw boundaries and take what didn't belong to them. There would be struggles and setbacks, and days when survival felt uncertain. But they'd face it together, Alice, with her fierce determination and practical skills, Chaska, with his quiet strength and knowledge of the land, Jack, growing up knowing both his father's legacy and his stepfather's love. They'd build a future from the ashes of the past, water it with tears and sweat and hope, and watch it grow into something worthy of the sacrifices that had made it possible. The sign creaked in the wind, "Want cook," and Alice smiled. She was so much more than a cook now. She was a wife, a mother, a fighter, a survivor. She was home. And that was enough.